Okay, we're going to go ahead and get going since we have a lot to cover in just this short hour. So thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Amanda Clevenger. I'm joined by my colleague Ian Simonides, and for the next hour, we're going to be talking through the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the IRA. A recording of this presentation is going to be shared with everybody after the presentation is done. So you don't need to take any screenshots or anything like that. We will send the recording out afterwards. Please take a moment to make sure that you are on mute. I recommend you check your mute button now so that we don't mute your mic for you. Please and thank you. And we will do a Q&A. We're going to do a Q&A at the end of the presentation. We're going to have plenty of time. Don't worry about it. But please put your questions in the chat box. We're going to be using the chat box to collect your questions. So while we're talking today, Ian's going to be reviewing all the questions that go into the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll go through and answer your questions. All right. So let's get going. So for those of you who may not be very familiar with Bray Power, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction about us, what we are, what we do. We offer energy management solutions for multifamily and commercial buildings. And what really makes us special is that we're offering a holistic approach. And that includes services like energy benchmarking, auditing, retrofit consulting, high performance building certifications, energy monitoring, solar, and a whole lot more. So we really understand that it takes a multifaceted approach to drive energy and cost reductions in your buildings. And so all of our teams are working together to help our clients meet their energy goals. And it's really unique to have all of that expertise under one roof. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that Bray Power does to help facilitate all of the projects that we do is to bring in incentives for the work we're doing. And we're a little bit different in that the incentive program research and liaising that we do for all of our clients is housed within its own team, and that's the policy and programs team. So Ian and I help all of our projects, whether it's solar or a retrofit or a ground up new construction project, we help all of them leverage cash rebates, tax credits, financing programs, and more. So not to toot our own horn, but we've helped our clients pursue several million dollars in NYSERDA and utility incentives over the past several years. So like we're pretty good at what we do. And there has never been a more important time to have this kind of expertise. Many of you may already be aware of this, but New York already offers dozens of different programs designed to help you make your buildings greener. And now with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, there's even more opportunities that are going to become available to access cash and tax advantages. So that's why we're talking about this today. There's a lot of new money coming, but at first glance, it's really hard to figure out how all of those things fit together for your projects. So we're going to start that discussion today so that as the rules for these new subsidies are developed, you will already know which programs you want to be keeping an eye on. Next slide. So moving on to our agenda, we're going to do several things today. We'll talk through a basic overview of what the law is and its impact on a broader level. We'll then talk through key pieces that are going to be most lucrative for your projects. Third, we'll talk about how to incorporate the IRA subsidies into your planning processes. And then at the end, we'll take some Q&A. Next slide. Okay. Next slide. So we'll start with some background about what the legislation is. Most of the compliance requirements and incentives for buildings currently come from either state or local governments or utilities. And in New York, incentives come from utilities and also from an entity called NYSERDA. And the planning for those programs is overseen by the state level regulator. And so the IRA is really exciting because this is the first substantive federal action on climate at the federal level that we've really ever seen. And so over the summer, Congress passed this legislation, which is now the single largest climate investment in our nation's history. It's a pretty big deal. It started last year under the Build Back Better negotiations, which you may have heard about in the news, died several times during those negotiations. And then Senator Schumer and Senator Manchin really out of the woodwork surprised everyone a few months ago with a deal that was ready to go. And so now that the bill has been signed, there's over $369 billion available for numerous initiatives that are going to fight climate change. So for today's sake, we're going to focus on what's in the IRA for our buildings. But the IRA has a lot more than just building focused subsidies. There's subsidies for like utility scale wind and solar. There's a focus on electrified transportation. There's funds for conservation efforts, and the list goes on and on. One of the things that I like to point out when we're talking about the IRA is that the IRA is heavier on carrots rather than the sticks, meaning that most of the legislation, especially for buildings, is comprised of incentives rather than regulations. And the reason for that is because we actually already have a lot of city and states with their own regulations for buildings. So like in New York City, we have Local Law 87 that requires audits and retrocommissioning for certain size of buildings. We also upcoming have Local Law 97 that's going to set carbon emissions caps for big buildings. And so there are now dozens of jurisdictions that have laws like that. And so the IRA actually really complements those compliance requirements that we already have. You know, there's a lot of folks who own buildings who are facing those compliance requirements, and they're saying, I don't have any money to do this project. And so the IRA, with all of the incentives in the IRA, is really going to complement that and help people execute on those projects. So I want everybody to take a look at this slide that we have up now. This, I hope, will really give everyone a sense of the impact the IRA will have nationwide. This is a graph from Rhodium Group that's showing the comparison between nationwide emissions reductions with and without the IRA. So in blue here, the blue dotted line, this is without the legislation, what our nationwide emissions reduction would look like. And in orange here is showing the emissions reductions with the IRA legislation. And we can see in the orange a significant reduction in emissions forecasted for 2030. So that's really exciting. We could see a 44% decrease in emissions across the country now that the IRA has been passed into law. Next slide. So continuing with the theme of just how unprecedented all of this really is, take a look at some of these anticipated funding levels for some of the subsidies that are included in the IRA. Most of these programs are going to use a few $1 billion each, right? We've got rebate programs that probably take $4 billion each, some tax credits that'll take a couple billion. And we'll walk through each of these in more detail later on, so don't worry about that. But to give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about, take a look at the bottom of the chart at the GHG Reduction Fund. This is a new EPA program that was included in the IRA legislation. It's going to get $27 billion. And this one program by itself has more than 3 times what the entire EPA used to get annually for the whole agency's budget. So like, that's a lot of money. And I say that because I think there was definitely some disappointment that this legislation didn't go even further than it did, which is what Congress was initially planning with Build Back Better last year. And even though they had to cut some things out, we still really have to recognize how unprecedented this is. You know, and like even with this sort of reduced amount of money, which is a weird thing to say, this is still going to change the entire landscape of our industry for the better. Next slide. So now we'll talk through some of the key subsidies one by one. One very important point that I would like to make as we go, all of the details that we're going to talk through today are still subject to change. Nothing is set in stone yet. What's happening is the federal agencies are undergoing rulemaking processes that could alter some of what you see here today. But we are keeping a very close eye on those developments so that as soon as we have more information, we'll be able to get that out to everyone. So please keep that disclaimer in mind as we go through this today. Okay, so first we're going to start with solar PV, storage, and EV charging. Next slide. Okay, so this first solar tax credit is for solar and energy storage on multifamily rentals and commercial buildings. We will get to condos and co-ops on a different slide. So just keep that in mind. I know we have a lot of co-op folks on the line today. So the investment tax credit has actually been around for a long time. It's been at least 10 years since this came out. But under the IRA, the ITC is getting a really big boost. The base credit is going up from 26 to 30%. There are several new bonuses on top of that 30% that we'll talk about in a second. There are a few key new features of the ITC that will start next year. Interconnection costs can now be claimed in addition to the normal equipment and labor. There's also a new direct pay feature, which will allow qualifying nonprofits to receive a cash payment that would help them avoid going through a syndicator to monetize the credit. So that's really, really exciting. We're looking forward to seeing how the rules shake out for direct pay, but it could be extremely helpful for nonprofits that want to do solar. And if you're interested in energy storage at all, you can now claim the ITC tax credit for storage, even if the storage is not paired with solar, which is another great change. One piece at the bottom that probably won't be relevant for most of you on this call, but just in case we have anybody maybe outside of the New York City metro area joining us today, if you're over 1 megawatt, there are prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements that now apply to get the ITC. So most of you will probably be under 1 megawatt, but just in case any of you are planning some big projects, just note that there are those extra requirements that apply. Next slide. So now diving into the new bonuses. Again, this is only multifamily rentals and commercial buildings. Condos and co-ops will do separately. So there's 5 bonuses here. And these are the bonuses that you get on top of the base ITC 30% credit. The first is the domestic content bonus. You can get a 10% bonus if you can show that the equipment was produced domestically. There's a short summary here on the slide of the 2 pieces of the requirement. The first being that you have to ensure that all the steel and iron are produced domestically. And the second is that a certain percentage, depending on the year, of all the goods are also produced domestically. I think for 2023, the required percentage for the bottom bullet will be 40%, but it's going to change every year. One thing to note on the domestic content front is that there are a few circumstances where the domestic content is not a bonus opportunity, but it actually becomes a requirement. For example, starting in 2024, if you want to get a direct pay payment, in order to get the full ITC value, you would have to meet these domestic content requirements to get that full payment. So that's one of a few select special circumstances where domestic content requirements are required and are not just a bonus as listed here on this slide. So moving to the next bonus, the energy communities bonus. Oops, you can stay on the slide. We got a little ways to go. So the energy communities bonus in the second row, this is a 10% bonus only for properties located on a specific map. The map includes mostly communities that are affected by fossil fuel job loss. So there's not many New York City neighborhoods that are probably going to be eligible for this, but it's still something that everyone should be aware of, because if you happen to be located within one of the eligible regions on the map, this will be one of the easier bonuses to file for in terms of paperwork. So it's still something to check for, even if you're thinking, it's New York City, we might not have anything there. Okay, so now getting into the 3 low-income bonuses in the bottom 3 rows here. The first is a 10% adder under the low-income communities category. This one is actually kind of similar to the energy communities bonus in that the only eligibility criteria we think they're going to use is that map. If you're located within the right region, you get the bonus. If not, you don't. And the interesting part about these categories that use the maps is that there could be some non-affordable housing that could qualify for these bonuses. So like if you have a market rate multifamily property or a commercial building that's located in a low-income community in that region on the map, you might be able to qualify for this too. So that's something to keep an eye out for. And then the last two low-income adders are both 20%. These are the two that we know the least about at the moment. They need a good bit of guidance in the forthcoming rules. These will only be for qualifying affordable housing, and there is a tenant benefit requirement for each of these that we don't fully know yet what that's going to entail. We will know more when the Treasury Department puts out rules at the latest in February. One important thing to note about all of the low-income bonuses is that unlike the other tax credits, which are handled by the IRS, these low-income bonuses are going to require a special application to the Treasury Department. It's not like you can just file this like all the other tax credits when you're filing with the IRS. So that's an important difference to note. There will be a special set of forms that go to the Treasury Department. So it will be extra work to go after the low-income bonuses. But considering the fact that you could get like 50% ITC, maybe even higher, I think it's still worth it. Next slide. Okay, so getting into solar tax credits for condos and co-ops. They're going to fall under this 25D tax credit. This is also a 30% tax credit. And the Rocky Mountain Institute is speculating that condo and co-op residents will be able to claim this credit individually, but we'll have to see how the rulemaking process plays out because that might change. Next slide. All right, EV charging. EV charging tax credits are getting a boost, but only for properties located in a qualifying low-income community or a non-urban census tract, meaning that for that latter requirement, you basically have to be in a rural neighborhood. The base rate for this tax credit, if you meet that eligibility requirement, is 6%, and that goes up to 30% for a project that meets prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. So I'll pass it over to my colleague, Ian Simonides, to talk through subsidies for energy efficiency and electrification projects.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. You can go to the next slide, Melissa. So yeah, I'm going to cover some of the energy efficiency tax credits and electrification tax credits, as well as some of the rebate programs included in the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide, please. So we'll start off with the energy efficient home tax credit, 45L. This is applicable only to multifamily affordable and market rate properties. So no commercial properties, and still to be determined whether condos and co-ops can use this tax credit. The rates are based on the certification that the project can attain. And so there's the EPA Energy Star certification, which will receive a $500 per dwelling unit incentive credit. And then there's the DOE's Zero Energy Ready Home certification, which will receive $1,000 per dwelling unit credit. Now, both of these credits will increase to $2,500 and $5,000 respectively if they meet prevailing wage requirements. So that's an important note there. Another important aspect of this is that taxpayers claiming LIHTC, LIHTC, would not have to reduce their basis for credits claimed under this section. That's a change in this version of the tax credit from previous versions of it. And additionally, this new version also includes multifamily high-rise properties, which is another change. It was previously limited to low-rise properties. Moving on to the next slide, we have the residential energy efficiency tax credit 25C. So this is available for co-op shareholders and condo owners. It's a 30% tax credit starting in 2023, not available for commercial multifamily rentals. And this is dollar per widget credits. So heat pump water heaters can get $2,000, windows and skylights, $600, Exterior doors, $250 per door or $500 for the whole year. Electrical infrastructure upgrades, things like panels, sub panels, $600. Building envelope upgrades, weatherization at $1,200, and then also $150 offered for an energy audit. And then moving on, we have the energy efficient commercial building deduction, 179D. This is both for new construction and existing building retrofits. Commercial and multifamily rentals are eligible, and again, to be determined for condos and co-ops. So projects here have to participate in a retrofit that reduces site EUI by at least 25%. In the previous version of 179D, it was a minimum of 50%. So it's become much more attainable for most projects, but might still be a little bit tough. But 25% is certainly better than 50% reduction. So here in the table, you can see what the deduction rates are. So the minimum is 25%, and without prevailing wage, 50 cents per square foot, with prevailing wage, $2.50 per square foot. And then it's an extra 2 cents per square foot or 10 cents per square foot, depending on the prevailing wage, all the way up to the maximum of 50% reduction at $1 per square foot and $5 per square foot. So just to give you a sense, a 30% reduction would be 60 cents per square foot or $3. 40% reduction would be 80 cents or $4. So there's a sliding scale there in terms of how much reduction in site EUI your project is able to attain. So that's it for 179D. And that is it for the credits and deductions. Now we're into the rebates. So we have two rebates here, starting with the homes rebate, as it's come to be known. This is for multifamily rentals, and again, to be determined for condos and co-ops. Before I dive in, I just want to take a step back though and level set on federal rebates. This is really the first time that we're seeing the federal government offer energy efficiency rebates like this. The WAP program has existed for some time, but that was really focused on a rather small sector of buildings across the country. And so this is actually quite exciting that this homes rebate and the HERA rebate that I'll get to in the next slide were included in the IRA, because we've never really seen this type of energy efficiency rebates coming from the federal government. So just wanted to mention that. And then, so just to give you a sense of the incentives here, there's sort of two different types of incentives depending on whether it's modeled energy savings or measured energy savings. So for the modeled energy savings, if it's savings between 20 and 34%, it's $2,000 per dwelling unit for market rate, $4,000 per dwelling unit for affordable housing with the respective caps there. And then for modeled energy savings above 35%, those rebate incentives go up to $4,000 per dwelling unit for market rate and $8,000 per dwelling unit for affordable housing with the respective caps. Now, in the bottom row here, we have measured building or portfolio energy savings. So this can either be for one specific building or across a portfolio of buildings. And you have a payment rate of per kilowatt hours saved up to $2,000 for a 20% or greater reduction in energy use. And that's $2,000 per dwelling unit. And that's for market rate. And then on the affordable side, similar structure, but $4,000 for a 15% or greater reduction in energy use per dwelling unit with the respective caps there as well. So that's it for the homes rebate. And then we have the high efficiency electric homes rebate. Now this is particular to certain qualifying affordable housing. Really no commercial, no market rate properties. Condos and co-ops, to be determined. The eligibility there is really going to depend on whether condos and co-ops can meet the affordability criteria required for the rebate. But it is open to both existing buildings and new construction. And again, we have dollar per widget rebates for heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, heat pump space heating, electric appliances, load service upgrades, which is integral if you're doing installing electric appliances and heat pumps, the wiring component as well, and the insulation, air sealing, ventilation, weatherization components for it. In terms of the affordability requirements, there are essentially two levels of eligibility that will dictate how much of the incentive you can receive. So that is how the qualifying affordable housing is going to work for those incentives. And moving on to the next slide, just wanted to go over for the homes in the HERA rebate programs, what we know in this moment and what we don't know in this moment, what's going to be coming. So the two rebates, the homes and the HERA rebates, can't be combined. You can't claim both. The funding is going to be allocated to state energy programs using this formula. We think that New York is going to get about 5% of the total funding. So the note there is that because the funding is going through the state energy program and will be allocated to the states have to come up with a plan for this funding and then submit it to the DOE. The DOE has to review it, okay it, and then the money will be dispersed. And moving on into what we don't know, the timing of this is a big question mark because the states have a certain amount of time to submit their plans. The DOE has a certain amount of time to review those plans. So it could be up to 2 years before these programs actually open. Additionally, the rebate structure might change. What's listed here in the slides and in the IRA are maximum rebates that the federal government has set out. Now, states might decide to do it, structure it a little bit differently and not offer the full incentive amount. So that remains to be seen as well. And then lastly, we really don't have a sense of how these rebate programs are going to interact with existing state level incentive programs. So in New York, we don't know how the homes in the HERA program will interact with NYSERDA rebates, with utility rebates. We're hoping that all of that will be explained in the state's plan that they submit to the DOE. So that's it for my piece. And please put any questions in the chat, and I'm going to hand it back over to Amanda.
Great. Thank you, Ian. Can we go to the next slide? There we go. Perfect. All right. So there's two other programs that we're going to talk about. So we've been talking about tax credits. We've been talking about rebates. There's two other programs that are going to be going to HUD and EPA that we'll talk about, and then we'll get into our Q&A. So we'll start with HUD. HUD is getting $1 billion to offer grants and loans as part of the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. Through this program, HUD will offer funds to HUD subsidized properties, which for buildings that can qualify could really be a game changer. The program is still being designed, but they've been mandated to offer money for everything from retrofits, heat pumps, indoor air quality improvements, solar, battery storage, you name it, they will probably fund it, which is rare for a program. So if you have a property participating in a HUD program like an 811 or a 202, programs like that are the ones that we anticipate will probably be eligible for this. I will say that these grants are probably going to take a little bit longer to get going. HUD has started the process of planning for this, but they don't have to spend the money until like 2028. So it could be a couple more years before we have firmer details on this. Next slide. Okay, and then the last one that we'll talk about is the EPA's new GHG reduction fund. So they have $27 billion, right? A lot of money, 3 times the whole EPA's budget. And there's 2 subcategories of where this money might go. The first, for qualifying nonprofits, they might be able to get money directly from this fund for certain types of decarbonization projects. And second, a lot of this money is probably going to go to green banks. We actually might even see the EPA set up a federal green bank, which currently doesn't exist. So that would be really cool. And even if the EPA decides not to set up a federal level green bank, there's still a lot of money here that would get pumped into local and state nonprofit financing agencies and green banks, which is really important because even though many states have green banks already, those green banks have been somewhat limited in terms of what they can offer. You know, they often say things like, we can only finance a project if it's over $1 million, which a lot of projects are not. Or sometimes the interest rates aren't that competitive, or the product isn't exactly what you need for the retrofit that you want to do. So I'm really excited to see this money get deployed, because what I'm hopeful will happen is that the green banks will have significantly more capital and can be more flexible with the products that they're offering. All right, next slide. Okay, so we've been talking for a while, probably talked about 20 or so different programs, and you're probably sitting there thinking, how on earth am I supposed to remember all of this stuff? That's why you have us, don't freak out. I'm going to talk you through the strategy that you need to keep in mind right now. And that is the following. So the only money that's available in 2022 are solar projects that are not going after any bonuses. That's it. So that's only for projects that are placed in service or were placed in service this year. They can get the new 30% solar tax credit level right now. Everything else that we covered is not going to be available until next year at the earliest, and some pieces will take more years after that. So for the most of the tax credits, we expect that guidance to be out within the next couple of months, so that you'll be ready to utilize those starting in the early part of next year. For the rebate programs that Ian was talking about, this timeline is a little bit blurrier right now. It's going to probably take at least 2 years. So all of the states technically have 2 years to submit plans to the feds on what they're going to do with these rebate programs. So it might be 2024 until we have a sense of what New York's going to do. It might move a little bit faster than that. We'll see. So that's the general timing that we're looking at now. Another thing about some of the tax credits is that a lot of these exist now in 2022, but they're getting improved for 2023. So don't get confused if you hear that some of these are available now. Most of them are available in some form, but they're going to get a lot better starting in January of 2023. So keep that in mind. So the federal agencies are undergoing all of their rulemaking processes, like I said at the top of the hour, finalizing all the eligibility requirements. They're finalizing the paperwork requirements. All of those key details the agencies are discussing right now. They're going to be releasing that, like I said, and for most of the things, not accepting the rebates, most of that will be released over the coming months. And so once we have that information, we will be able to sit down and to start getting your projects ready to incorporate these subsidies. We can say, we can sit down and say, here's 4 or 5 programs that you might be eligible for. Let's figure out how you can stack them, how we can maximize the funding for your project. So we're not quite ready to do that now, but once the rules come out, we will be ready to start those conversations. Okay, next slide. We should be ready for our Q&A. All right, opening it up for questions. So Ian is going to field all of your questions in the chat. So please submit them in the chat now. And we'll talk through for the remaining 25 minutes, whatever questions you have.
Great. So we've had a number of questions come in through the chat, but we also had a number of questions come in from clients before the webinar. So I'm going to start there, and then we'll get to some of the questions that people have sent in. So starting off with a question on how long will the rulemaking process take?
Yeah, so going back to what I was saying just now, it's going to vary depending on which program we're talking about. So for solar projects that are not pursuing any bonuses, you can get that 30% now. You don't have to wait for the rules to come out. For all of the tax credits, except for the low income solar bonus, for all of the tax credits, solar, the energy efficiency, and some of the other ones that we talked about, the 179D deduction, for example, all of that is undergoing rulemaking with the IRS right now. And the IRS is hoping to have that out by December, hopefully, fingers crossed. For those of you who want to go after the low income solar bonuses, that's going to take a little bit longer. So the Treasury Department is doing the rules for the low income bonuses, and those are expected to be ready in February of 2023. So the Treasury Department will put that out, and then we'll have more information about how you can apply for those low income bonuses. And then for the rebate programs, like we just said, that's going to take a little while. DOE is going to manage the implementation plans with the states. So that's going to take some time, could take 2 years, like we said. So it will vary, but it's moving. The wheels are moving.
Great. So we've got a question here about direct pay and whether direct pay is only for nonprofits, and if so, how is that defined?
Yes, so direct pay, there's a couple in the legislation itself, there's a couple of different categories of buildings that are eligible for direct pay. The only one that's really relevant to you all are going to be qualifying nonprofits. The other ones are like tribal lands and other things that are probably not going to be super relevant to folks that are based here in New York City. So for your purposes, you have to be incorporated as a 501c3. The question that we haven't gotten a great answer to yet is if you are a nonprofit and you are installing solar, but the solar is owned by an LLC where there might be a for-profit entity as co-owner of that LLC, that's a situation where we're not 100% sure yet if they will qualify for direct pay. That's something that the Treasury Department and IRS will have to clarify.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. So we have a question here about, you mentioned a possibly 50% ITC and sort of a question around what scenario might produce that level of tax credit.
Yes, so that's if you go after the base ITC. So the base ITC is now 30%. And then if you go after one of the 20% low income adders, there's one low income adder that's 10%, and there's two that are at the 20% level. That's how you could potentially get to a 50% ITC level. Again, that has to be confirmed that you can do that in the rules, but I will say that we worked very closely with Sunrun's policy team and some other folks to get that piece of the language included in the legislation. And so the intent is to allow people to stack the bonuses and the base credit. So hopefully that is the way that the IRS will interpret it too, and the Treasury Department.
Got it. Great. We've got a little simple clarifying question here about what a dwelling unit is, whether it's a tenant unit or an entire building that may have 10 to 30 units.
So a dwelling unit generally refers to one apartment. Yeah.
Great.
Or one condo or one co-op, depending on what type of building you have. But it's one apartment, could have multiple bedrooms, but just one apartment.
So can an owner receive both 45L and 25C tax credits?
That is an interesting question that we'll have to see how it plays out in the rules. That would mostly apply to condos and co-ops. The 25C credit, as a reminder, is for energy efficiency and electrification for condos and co-ops only. So if you are one of those two building types, you might be in the category of being able to get 25C and 45L, which is the credit for multifamily that goes after an Energy Star certification. So 25C is definitely open to condos and co-ops. 45L is one that hasn't been clarified yet.
Great. Okay, so question here about the low income adder. Is the 20% low income adder expected to be first come, first serve, competitive application process? Will projects already under development be excluded from applying for it?
Those are great questions. So the 3 low income bonuses, like I said, you're going to have to apply to the Treasury Department. And you're right, there are a few special rules that apply only to those low income projects that are applying for those bonuses. The first is that individual projects can be no more than 5 megawatts in capacity. So that's the first rule. The second rule is that the Treasury Department is only allowed to take 1.8 gigawatts of low income projects every year. So that means that there could be some people who get left out. Hopefully not many, But once the Treasury Department gets that number of applications every year, they will cut it off and you will have to wait until the following calendar year to try and apply again. As for if you can apply that for projects that are already underway, that's a question that hasn't been answered yet that the Treasury Department will have to clarify.
Excellent. So another question we have here is whether condos and co-ops are eligible for the homes and HERA rebates.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So as a reminder, the homes and HERA rebate programs are not tax credits, right? They will eventually be administered by each state, and it will probably look somewhat similar to the utility and NYSERDA incentives that many of you are using now. So we anticipate that condos and co-ops should be eligible for homes and HERA, but that will be up to the states to decide. And the reason is that it's easier to lump multifamily rentals and condos and co-ops together for incentive, cash-based incentive programs, I should say, rather than tax credits, right? Because the ownership structures are very different, and that creates issues for tax credits and tax deductions, which is why condos and co-ops are not treated the same as multifamily rentals and commercial buildings. But historically, for cash rebate programs that utilities and NYSERDA have offered over the years, condos and co-ops can participate as a normal multifamily building would, and there's no issue. So that's what we're going to be advocating for as the homes and HERA rebate programs are developed.
Excellent, excellent. So I've got a couple of questions here that I'm going to try and combine into one, and it's sort of about, sort of New York specific in terms of asking about Local Law 97 and what might be the best tax credits, incentives from what we've gone over for condos and co-ops or multifamily buildings to use to comply with upcoming Local Law 97 compliance and to avoid fines.
Yeah, I'm sure this is really top of mind for a lot of you, so I get it. The first thing I should say is that the compliance requirements under Local Law 97 vary for different types of properties. So I'm going to speak to properties that are subject to their normal emissions cap, but there are many properties who are subject to the prescriptive measure pathway, particularly affordable housing properties. So please connect with us if you have questions. If you're like, I don't know what my Local Law 97 pathway is, that's a question you can bring to the Bright Power team and we can talk you through it. So assuming that you are subject to your normal emissions cap, a lot of buildings, especially starting in 2030, are facing some significant fines and are definitely going to want to explore retrofit and electrification options. The first step is always to start with an audit and get an assessment of your building, which is something that we can do. I will say that the only buildings that can get any audit incentives from the IRA subsidies are condos and co-ops, and it's small. It's only like, it's going to be a $150 tax credit that should become available starting early next year. So that's it. For multifamily rentals and commercial buildings, there's not any audit incentives in the IRA. And for condos and co-ops, there's that very small amount that you can claim in a tax credit, as a tax credit, I should say. So starting with the audit is always the great first step. And since the subsidies in the IRA for audits aren't great, I think you can go ahead and get started on that now, even though we are still waiting on IRA rules to be developed. So I think getting the audit done now is a good first step. And then once we start thinking about implementation work to meet your Local Law 97 emissions cap, there's a lot of different subsidies under the IRA that will hopefully be able to help you. I mean, everything that we talked about today could potentially benefit your project in trying to meet your 97 goals, particularly some of the programs now that will offer money for electrification. So that's the 25C for condos and co-ops that we talked about. We'll have some money for both efficiency and electrification. There's also the HERA rebates for multifamily rentals and possibly condos and co-ops, like I said, that will have money for heat pumps, electrical upgrades, which is great, which will all be really beneficial as you're starting to think about potentially electrifying your property to comply with Local Law 97.
Excellent. I'm sure a lot of people appreciated us covering that interaction between IRA and Local Law 97. But back to an IRA specific question, again, sort of about layering different components of what's in the IRA. Can a project take both the homes rebate and the 179D or 45L tax credit?
So the answer is likely yes. The only thing that is expressly prohibited in the legislation is that you can't use the two rebate programs together. That's the homes, whole building retrofits with the HERA electrification rebates. So you definitely can't use those together, but everything else is likely a yes. And so we'll make sure that the rules say that once they come out. But you should be able to use both the rebates and the tax credits, which would be great.
Excellent. So we have a clarifying question here about what does standalone energy storage mean?
Yeah, standalone energy storage is referring to a storage system that is not necessarily paired with solar PV. So the change in the ITC tax credit for 2023 is that you no longer have to have the storage paired in order to claim the tax credit for your storage system. That's the way that it used to work. But now they're saying essentially that you can get the tax credit for the storage by itself, which is awesome. So if you already have solar PV maybe, or if you don't want solar for some reason, your property's not a good fit for it, but you do want to invest in a storage system, now you can claim the ITC tax credit for that storage system, which is great.
Excellent. If we could go back, I guess 2 slides now, just one last question on timing. So there's a question here, do these timelines include the time for the states, NYSERDA, for example, to do their administrative setup, or just the federal part?
Great question. So he's referring to the homes and HERA rebate programs. Those are the two that will probably be run by NYSERDA once they're ready to go. So the timing that we've been talking about for those rebate programs is only for the state of New York to submit to DOE the plans on how it's going to run these programs. It's going to probably take longer to get these out onto the street, because most incentive programs that are run by NYSERDA or by the utilities, usually they have a third-party administrator. And so NYSERDA and the utilities will have to put this out to bid for an entity to run the program, which could add a year. Hopefully it won't take that long. In addition to crafting the rules and making sure they can, fairly check everyone's income status for some of those pieces that are dependent on a certain income bracket. So it will take likely longer than 2 years to see those programs, but it will depend on how quickly New York can apply to the DOE to get the money from the starting point.
Great. So we have a question about the timing of direct pay, and when that refund will come from the Treasury Department, whether there'll be a lag between the solar PTO date and the refund date.
That is a great question that is going to be defined in the rules they haven't said yet.
Great. Okay, let's see here. Any other critical questions? I don't believe we have anything else super critical. Oh, there's still some questions coming in. So do you foresee that the ITC credits for solar PV will have much utility in New York City?
I certainly think so. I mean, we've seen some solar development in the city. Obviously, interest in solar in New York City is not quite as strong as it would be in other places where it's less expensive to build. But I do certainly think that the ITC will help to push some solar development in the city. I think that's a fair assessment.
Great. Do we know if there are any components of a building that would that a project could not get incentives for? The examples are swimming pools and things like that. And yeah, thoughts on that?
So well, there's a couple of things that might not qualify. So the biggest category that the legislation did not specifically address for most of these programs that we talked about today are health and safety upgrades. So oftentimes buildings will have mold, asbestos, lead, you name it, vermin. New York City, you might have all of those in the same building. So that's the biggest gap that the legislation didn't address specifically. And it's unclear whether those measures will make it in during the rulemaking process. Historically, programs like these try to stick specifically to measures that are either driving energy efficiency improvements or are electrification measures, incentivizing high efficiency heat pumps, electrical upgrades. Some of the supporting measures like that will be included, but for the most part right now, the biggest question are those health and safety measures and whether they're going to be included.
Great, great. Appreciate that clarification. We've got another question about how the tax credits will be distributed to condo owners and co-op shareholders. For example, is the $150 tax credit an audit for each unit or the condo as a whole or the whole building?
So generally, it would serve the whole building. So you would get an audit for the whole building, and then what we're hoping for is that each resident of a condo or a co-op would be able to claim that full $150 for that audit. There is a chance that in the rules, the agencies will say that instead of each resident being able to claim the full amount listed here on the slides, that the residents instead would have to claim a proportional amount. So it would be $150 divided by however many residents you have. So that is also a possible outcome, but we're hoping that it will be the former and that each resident will be able to claim the full amount listed.
Great, great. Another question here about homes in HERA and whether every state is going to offer both of those programs since the funding is going to be distributed to each state separately.
Yeah, it's my hope that every state can offer homes and HERA rebates. States will ultimately have the decision or can make the decision about whether or not they want to apply for the money. And the DOE is technically allowed to redistribute money from a state that doesn't submit plans to implement the homes and HERA programs. But I mean, we certainly want to see rebates like that available everywhere, particularly in states that have not had strong energy efficiency programs from their utilities or maybe from a third party. These rebates from the IRA could be the very first opportunity that they've ever had to get incentives to upgrade the equipment in their buildings. So my hope is that every state will apply. And so there are a lot of there's a lot of advocacy going on behind the scenes to try to convince some of those states that maybe weren't really showing a whole lot of interest in this to get them to apply for the money on behalf of their constituents.
Great. Okay, I see we've got a couple minutes left. Some more questions just to wrap things up. What programs are specifically available for affordable new construction?
There's a couple of programs that are available for affordable new construction. The most exciting one for properties that are pursuing Energy Star certification is that 45L tax credit that under the IRA was improved to work better for affordable housing, which is great. So they're now including high-rise multifamily, which they didn't used to include. And they also clarified that regulated affordable housing that's going after a LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit award, participating in 45L would not reduce their basis for the award, which is excellent. There's also a chance that the 179D deduction may make sense for some affordable housing new construction. The deduction is definitely open to new construction properties. The question will be that the legislation itself didn't clarify whether or not that would affect basis like it did for the 45L. So we're going to need to wait in the rules to see how that shakes out. In terms of rebate programs, the HERA electrification rebates are going to be open to new construction properties, which could be really helpful depending on the configuration this is assuming that many new construction properties that are affordable housing are including heat pumps in their design, which is what we've seen. The HERA rebates are open to new construction, which is great. But with the way that they're currently designed in the dollar per widget structure, they may not make that big of a dent depending on what type of heat pump configuration you're installing, which is going to be an issue across all multifamily. And that's something that we are working with a lot of different parties who have been involved in this rules process. We've been working very hard to try and make those rebates work better for multifamily properties. And so, yeah, there's also, I mean, there's ITC for solar as well, and some of the new low income bonuses that might be a good fit if they're installing solar. So yeah, there's a lot of different things here that could be really beneficial to affordable housing new construction.
You sort of alluded to a little bit in that answer, but someone followed up with a question about which programs are best for multifamily low-income renovations and preservation.
Yeah, so many of the same programs that I just touched on are going to be a good fit. The other one to keep in mind is the homes rebate program that is probably not going to be open to new construction, but is available to existing building retrofits and rehabs. That's going to offer quite a bit of money, particularly for affordable housing. They're going to get double what market rate properties are going to get for those retrofits. And that is really exciting because, a lot of retrofits and rehabs aren't doing enough work to meet the threshold for the homes rebates, but for a property that's undergoing like a deep rehab or a deep renovation, they're in a much better position to be ready to leverage those homes rebates. I think we are at time.
We are, absolutely.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are out of time. I know that we couldn't get to everybody's questions. We had some great questions today, but please reach out to your Bright Power account manager with any additional questions that you have. If you are new to Bright Power, you can send an email to the address that's listed here on the slide, info@brightpower.com, and we'll connect you with one of our account managers. And last but not least, before we go, I would like to give a big thank you to our marketing team for helping to coordinate this session. The Bray Power marketing team is truly one of a kind, and they did an absolutely fantastic job. So everyone, please, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.